Hello and welcome to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. It's good to see you all. Yes, we love a call and response moment. I am Dr. Crystal Moten. I'm Associate Director for Collections. And tonight, the Lapidus Center for the Historical Analysis of Transatlantic Slavery and Schomburg Education present Slavery, Abolition, and Emancipation in New York City. This event is designed to supplement information for the new curriculum, A History of Slavery in New York City. Before we begin, I'd like to extend a special thank you, first to the Lapidus Center, and then secondly to Schomburg Director Joy Bivens for her support on this event. I would also like to recognize the leader of Schomburg Education, Associate Director Shirley Brown-Elaine, who cannot be with us tonight. So I am filling some pretty big shoes in opening and closing this program, but she has planned a wonderful night for us, and so I am grateful to her. Many of you may be familiar with the person on the screen. This is Arturo A. Schomburg. Arturo was born in Puerto Rico in 1874, the son of a Puerto Rican merchant of German descent and an Afro-Caribbean woman from St. Croix. When Arturo was young, a school teacher told him that Black culture lacked major figures and noteworthy history. In essence, Black people had no history worth knowing. He disagreed with this and embarked on a lifelong search for proof of the good works done by people of African descent. And he called this his search for vindicating evidences. He found a good many. In 1905, the New York Public Library opened the 135th Street branch. As the surrounding neighborhood changed from Jewish to Black, so too did the patrons of the library. In 1924, Mr. Schomburg met with library staff to discuss how the collections could reflect their community. In 1925, the Division of Negro Literature, History, and Print, which is the forerunner to Schomburg Center, opens. And this division becomes one of the first archives dedicated to Black history. In 1926, Mr. Schomburg sold his collection to the NYPL, to the 135th Street branch, for $10,000. He used that money to purchase more items for the collection. Eventually, he worked for the branch until his death in 1938. In 1940, the division is renamed to honor him. And in 1972, we become one of the New York Public Library's research libraries, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Today, we have over 11 million items representing the global African diaspora. Yeah, that is clap-worthy. This year, 2025, marks our centennial year. We are 100 years old, and we look forward to so many, many, many more years of Black research, Black culture, and celebrating and engaging those stories. Thank you. So when we think about the structure of the Schomburg Center, we are organized into 5 divisions: Art and Artifacts, the Jean Blackwell Hudson Research and Reference Division, Manuscript Archives and Rare Books, Moving Image and Recorded Sound, and Photograph and Prints. And what is so wonderful about the Schomburg Center is that anyone can come visit and research in any of our divisions. The only thing you need is a New York Public Library library card. Everyone is welcome. So because Shirley isn't here, I would love to take the opportunity to heap amounts and amounts of praise on her department, Schomburg Education. And as you know, part of what Schomburg Education does is hosting professional learning workshops for teachers. That's why we're here tonight. And you also know that these workshops typically provide CTLE credit, and we're so happy that that is possible. In addition, we have conversations in Black Freedom Studies. These take place either virtually or in person on the first Thursday of the month, and they offer talks about Black history based on specific themes. Teachers can also receive CTLE credits for those. We also have the Schomburg Center's Junior Scholars Program, and the Junior Scholars Program hosts 100 students on Saturdays. We love the vibrant energy that JSP brings to Schomburg Center on Saturdays. This free program teaches students grades 6 through 12 about stories from the African diaspora. From October to December, they learn how to conduct research in an archive, and they engage with a wonderful array of guest speakers, such as Dr. Bettina Love and the legendary cartoonist Barbara Brandon Craft. Then, from January to May, scholars are divided into project groups. These groups, including drama, podcasts, spoken word, music, documentary film, and the visual arts, use their research to create pieces. For example, last year, after a visit in our manuscripts, archives, and rare books division, the visual arts group gravitated toward the Black ABCs. The group decided then to create their own updated version. And here it is. It was so successful. And it was so successful that it's now on tour. It was sent to the National Civil Rights Museum for display. Our Junior Scholars Program and the students in it use their skills that they learn to become leaders in the field. And I'm gonna embarrass former junior scholar who is tonight's moderator, Marquise Taylor, as an example of how one of our JSP scholars is using their experiences in the field. Yeah. So last but not least, we have the Schomburg Center's curriculum. Currently, we have 8 curriculum, 1 about the life and legacy of Arturo Schomburg, and the rest, as you see in this slide, are under specific themes such as Black power, Black women's stories, slavery, and abolition. And I know Shirley is always working on ideas for more. Each is designed for middle and high school classrooms. They feature unique primary sources, and they are meant to supplement classroom curriculum, and many of them have been translated into Spanish. Our newest curriculum is a history of slavery in New York City, and that is the basis of tonight's program. This online curriculum has primary sources and contextual information that educators can use in the classroom. So we can take a moment, and if you would like, you can scan this QR code, and you can have access to the educational resources that we've prepared for you. And if you don't have a device that can scan a QR code, no worries. You'll receive an email after the event, and it will have a link to these resources. Just scanning to make sure everyone had the opportunity. All right, okay. So, a little interactive moment, a test, if you will. So, your knowledge of slavery in New York City. The first question is, raise your hand if you knew slavery existed in New York State. Raise your hand. Okay, I think that's mostly all of us. Raise your hand again if you knew New York State was a large slave state, so a large slave state. Yep. Raise your hand again if you knew that Brooklyn, New York was the second largest slaveholding capital in the United States. So raise your hand. Did you know that Brooklyn, second largest? Yeah, and typically we think that the large slaveholding capitals are in the South, right? All right, so then finally, Shirley wanted me to ask you to raise your hand if you knew that some Black New Yorkers who migrated or immigrated to New York in the 1800s were abolitionists. Yeah, fantastic. So you knew all of these answers, but there's gonna be so much more information in the conversation that I am so excited to listen to tonight. And so I wanna take the time to introduce our panelists. So firstly, I would like to introduce Dr. Preeti Kamakammadala. And Dr. Preeti is a professor of history at Bronx Community College and at the CUNY Graduate Center. Her book, Brooklynites, The Remarkable Story of the Free Black Communities That Shaped the Borough, tells the story of Black Brooklynites. Her book has a corresponding curriculum, In Pursuit of Freedom, that is available online for all to use. Dr. Preeti is a public historian and consults with artists, curators, and cultural organizations across the city. So welcome, Dr. Preeti. Next, we have New York-based public historian Cynthia R. Copeland. Cynthia Copeland has consulted on many projects related to the legacy of slavery, including the African burial ground in Lower Manhattan. In addition to her accomplishments, she was one of the historians, curators, and educators on the groundbreaking exhibitions and corresponding curriculums, Seneca Village and Slavery in New York. Currently, she teaches at NYU's Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development, and facilitates dialogic teaching and learning workshops for the Center for Trauma Resilient Communities, Crossnor Communities from Children in North Carolina. Please welcome Cynthia Copeland. Yes. Last but certainly not least, we have our moderator, Marquise Taylor. In addition to being a former junior scholar, he is a PhD candidate in history at Northwestern University. His dissertation explores how Black youth have shaped political and social movements across the first half of the 20th century. In addition, as the recipient of the Mellon Foundation's pre-doctoral fellowship in public history at the Tenement Museum, he has served as the lead researcher for the Tenement Museum's exhibition about a family who resided in Lower Manhattan during the Civil War era, Union of Hope, 1869. Currently, though, he is investigating the experiences of Black converts to the Catholic Church during the post-Civil War era. So welcome Marquise to the stage. I'm so excited for this conversation, and I will turn it over to Marquise.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. I'm joined by Cynthia Copeland and Dr. Preeti Kamakammadala, and we're excited today to talk about slavery, abolition, and emancipation in New York City. So let's get started with the first question. Let's take it all the way back to the 17th century. And so my first question for you both is, what role did New York City play in transatlantic slavery?
Thank you, Marquise. Cynthia, do you want to take it?
That is such a big question. We could be here for weeks to talk about that. And but first of all, thank you for having me and to be a part of this panel. It's always any opportunity we get to sort of drop some wisdom and knowledge as we continue to uncover these stories of the African experience, the early African American experience in this city is just what we love to do. And I would say that, and by the way, this is like a conversation, right? And you all are invited into the conversation as well. I was telling my colleagues here, I said, you know, sometimes when we're asked to do these presentations, and sometimes I feel like a little bit of a warped record because, you know, we're sending out this information, but then I say to myself and to each other, we say to each other that, yeah, we know it, and we tell these stories, and some of the people in the audience may know some things, maybe they don't know things, and it's all new, so we can't take it for granted that everybody knows, right? Because this is our business, and so we're always digging in the archives, going down the rabbit holes, and finding all these new stories. But to get the conversation going, thinking about what was happening in the 17th century, we start with, well, first of all, I do want to acknowledge that we are on land of indigenous people. And the Lenni Lenape, this idea of European contact coming over to explore and or discover land that was already occupied is just kind of mind-boggling. But once that happened, though, we do have an array of European contact that comes, and the Dutch in particular, we're going to start with the Dutch, sort of bringing over individuals to set up their spaces in New Netherland and then down here in New Amsterdam, bringing in scouts, bringing in African men from different locations throughout Africa to be able to sort of set up and be the actual unpaid laborers to provide and create the infrastructure for the Dutch as they are beginning to set up their settlements and to basically come over here to, as I always say, make a buck, right? Because they are here, they are wiping out the beavers, they are, you know, extracting all kinds of resources from the lands, and they are using African people to help them in this process. Now, some people will say that the Dutch were a little bit different than the British who come later in terms of having a relationship, if you will, with those who they enslaved. And it's kind of a tricky, you know, that the enslavement was very complex during that time period because sometimes people were thinking, the Dutch were thinking of them more as laborers, free laborers, but they also had strictures on their mobility and on things that they could do. Yet they said, oh, well, you can come into our churches, you can get married, you can have, you can be baptized, we will honor you, eventually we're gonna give you some land. But it was always a fight and always a struggle. And there was always this notion that Black Africans were lesser than and only here for the purpose of building up the infrastructure that is happening in all of the boroughs. You know, there's a flavor of, the Dutch flavor is on Staten Island, it's certainly in Brooklyn, and Brooklyn before it was Brooklyn, you know, it was Flatlands and Utrecht and Flatbush and all these different locations, but because it was vast farmland, agricultural spaces, the African people were, in addition to building the infrastructure, were also here to do the agricultural work, to plant, to harvest, and to basically get the work started. They start with a lot of males, eventually females come over because there's this idea of you have to build up the population because we need to have more and more people to help with the developing New Amsterdam and the spaces that we're in. And this is happening until about 1664, thereabouts, when the British come in. But I'm going to hand it over to Priti to fill in a little bit more and have a talk.
Cynthia, thank you. And thank you so much to everybody for coming out tonight. If you're a DOE teacher, I know you've got 2 weeks left of this semester. Congratulations, you're almost there. And I just want to shout out, in case she's watching online, to our dear colleague Shirley, who really is instrumental in not just today's event, but everything that you see coming out of the Schomburg in terms of education and teacher outreach. So this is still fresh in my mind because I'm a CUNY professor and we're in finals week, so I was reviewing all the dates, and I was saying to Cynthia, it's funny, students will look at you and be like, you're a historian, don't you remember all these dates? I'm like, yes, but I'm not an encyclopedia. Like, I don't remember every single date, but I do remember. Slavery is fundamental to the story of this place we call home. As long as New Amsterdam existed as a capitalist project for the Dutch West India Company, so did slavery, right? In 1624, when the Dutch West India Company come and displace and murder the indigenous people of this land, by 1626, you have the first Africans that Cynthia was talking about coming here, somebody like Manuel de Groot. By 1628, you have black women such as Dorothy Creole, who will also be forced to work on this land as an enslaved person. And so, you know, I know we have a new mayor-elect, very popular. I adore him too, but he had a lot of critique recently because he said this was a city built by immigrants. And as somebody who is an immigrant, you can tell from my accent, and is of South Asian descent, like Zoran, no, that's not true, right? This is a city that was built by the labor of enslaved people of African descent. And so I think knowing our history, our city's history, acknowledging our, you know, each other and our neighbors and how we came to be to this city is crucial, not just for ourselves as educators or, you know, I've lived here 20 years and I can't bring myself to call myself an American, but as Americans, but as New Yorkers, right? And we owe that to our students to understand the connections. So slavery in New York existed because New York was always dreamt of in a European fashion as a capitalist post, right? As an outreach, as an outpost, rather.
Thank you, thank you. So I want us to think about more contemporarily, and with this conversation about slavery, where can we see the remnants of slavery contemporarily? Where are some of the sites that we can see it at? Where does the afterlives of slavery exist in New York City?
Sure. Oh, I was going to ask you, Cynthia, to speak about the African burial ground.
All right, so wherever you walk, you put your feet on the ground, there is evidence of enslavement. In the street names that we have throughout all of the boroughs, you can Nostrand, you know, you have these are the slave-owning families, right? The enslavers who are there who made so much money off of the free labor of the individuals who were here. If you go down to lower Manhattan where it all began and then sort of works its way up, obviously we have the African burial ground, which to this day a lot of people have no clue that the African burial ground existed down in lower Manhattan between Duane and Reed Streets, right? Between Broadway and Elm Streets, and then of course the expanse of that burial site from that time period was just enormous. You can go to cemeteries are very big in each borough. You can find cemeteries of the formerly enslaved. You can find on Staten Island, there is Cherry Hill Cemetery, which is actually on a site that is currently a strip mall and a parking lot. And it's the Santander Bank is on this site. And within that area that was once the Cherry Hill burial ground is the last enslaved person born on Staten Island buried in that site, and we have found the descendants of that particular person. And so there's always battles to try to find out how do we protect these sacred sites, even though they've been covered over, likely preserved, which was the case with the African burial ground. That too was a parking lot, right? And it was, folks thought that they would never find anything under there. And then, of course, when the federal government was going to build that building, the new building, and the skeletal remains started to reveal themselves, not terribly deep in the ground. It was maybe 18 inches beneath the surface. They start to uncover the skeletal bones, and because in the case of the African burial ground, which was just such a historic find, the fact that the government was had purchased the property and was going to build on that land, and they had to stop. They had to halt the construction because these bones started to reveal themselves. And so the idea is that if you are receiving any funds from the government, you have to halt to see if there's anything of historical significance. So there is a law in place, and that is why we were able to halt that. And it just so happened that at that moment, one of the city's anthropologists and archaeologists happened to be around when this reveal came, and he was there, and then contacted somebody, Peggy King Norder, and they got down there. And I mean, it really was almost a feeling, people would say, like divine intervention that had occurred, and then the descendant community became involved, and that's how we have the burial ground. But you know, I'm rambling because that is probably our most prominent space that gives you notice that there were indeed an early African American presence in New York. But again, just walking around the city, there are architectural buildings also down in that particular area. Over in the Tribeca area, there's the home of Theodore Wright, and there's the home of David Ruggles that was a member of started the lead of the Vigilance Society, trying to help folks save people from enslavement who were coming up, the freedom seekers that were coming. In the churches that we have, you can go into the churches and you can find Trinity Wall Street. You know, I mean, they're just everywhere. There's just, all you have to do is just sort of open your eyes and take a look, and you will see architecture, gardens, cemeteries, schools, etc., everywhere.
And I just want to shout out that that work is ongoing, right? There are places or spaces being found constantly in which neighbors and residents are trying to organize around it in similar ways that happened back in 1991. I'm thinking of the Flatbush African Burial Ground Coalition, who fought really hard to sort of landmark it, or at least get some sort of place marker there. There is also, if you go up in the Bronx, Van Cortlandt Park, a great deal of work being done in collaboration with the Park Service just to get a plaque up. And it reminds me of your work that you did, Cynthia, with Seneca Village, and the amount of bureaucracy it takes just to be able to acknowledge elders and ancestors who were here long before us. And I'm also thinking there is a bunch of organizers right now in West Farms out in the Bronx who are also organizing and trying to figure out, and I was just speaking to Cynthia Marquise about this, you know, they're on private land, so who do I need to connect them with? Because they're not part of the Park Service, or it wouldn't be speaking to a church necessarily. So this work is happening constantly, and I just, you know, I've been teaching with Cynthia's sort of work and ethos and materials for years now. Cynthia, to me, is such a mentor and so amazing, and has been doing this work. But, you know, Cynthia talks a lot about walking and what do we walk on and the soil that we walk on. And so there is, you know, our colleague Kamal Wire, who does Black Gotham Experience, will take you down to Lower Manhattan and make you walk those same streets and figure out where that slave market was, and figure out where those buildings were, right? You're at the center of capitalism. How did all those companies make their money? So I think walking as true New Yorkers is one of the best things you can do, both with your students and, you know, by yourselves or with your friends.
Indeed, and don't forget the shoreline, right? The waterfront in Brooklyn and in Lower Manhattan, the South Street Seaport, looking at those old buildings that exist. We can't tell you enough how important it is to just get out there and use New York City as your laboratory, because there is so much learning that can take place in a variety of locations in every single borough. You will be able to find your hidden gems. And you know, I want to also say another thing about the archives. Using the archives are very important, although for many, many years the archives actually have silenced the voices and the stories of enslaved people and people who have been dispossessed. And I think that once you as educators perhaps connect with professors or on your own, you are able to sort of dig into the archives now that we have things online. You can spend weary hours in the morning when you should be in bed, going on and on and on, digging down and digging through the newspaper articles, newspaper accounts, all kinds of title deeds. I mean, there's just a plethora of information out there. So get out there and explore.
Thank you both. So now that we've established that slavery is inextricably linked to the origin and development of this city, can we talk a little bit about what slavery would have looked like in New York City, thinking about the labor that enslaved people are doing? Crystal opened up this program sharing that New York City was the second largest slaveholding capital at one point in this country's history. So can we talk a little bit about that?
So if we're thinking about who was broadening Broadway, if we're thinking about who was building the wall on Wall Street, that was the labor of enslaved people. What we also need to look to is slavery was just as horrific as it was in the South. It just looked slightly different, right? So you had enslaved people who were living in very close quarters with their slave holders, and what that must have looked like for enslaved people, often sleeping in the kitchens, and is it normally 2 to 3 enslaved people per slaveholder? So it looked different, but I always sort of emphasize in the classroom, it was certainly no horrific. Just because Cynthia had mentioned it about looking in archives, and I just want to shout out Shirley and the new curriculum again here at the Schomburg, A History of Slavery in New York City. There are archives that the education team here have pulled out that can help you, so you're not having to look for this stuff yourself. I know it is a busy time of semester. You are grading, you're getting all of that assessment in, and the last thing you want to do, or maybe it is the first thing you want to do, is be sat on a database looking for something. But there is a newspaper advertisement in the curriculum for a young person who has run away, right? A slave advertisement that was very typical in colonial newspapers. There is a wealth of information to be found in those newspapers exactly about the kind of labor that Black men, women, and children were doing, about the plethora of languages that they could speak, right? That they could speak English and Dutch, and that was, of course, attractive to slaveholders. The one that I believe is included in the curriculum, and Shirley has made, I promised Shirley I would say this, that it is in the electronic packet that she handed out to all of you. You would have received it. That particular advertisement refers, again, in the most racist terms, to a Black woman as a Negro wench, right? The idea being that this is a woman that is either of birthing age or has had a child. And so there is so much information that you can get from these advertisements, even as you read through the kind of structural racist language of it all, to understand the complicated lives and hopes of Black people who lived here in New York City in this particular time period.
And in thinking about those ads, and being in close proximity to your enslaver, but at the same time being invisible, right? Except for the work that you provide for the enslavers. But if you run away, they know an awful lot about you. You had a crooked tooth, you walk with a limp, you took off with a broadcloth coat, and again, they know all of the skill sets that you have, and those advertisements are just so remarkable, and I think that if you aren't using them, you should start to use them. And I think you can use them with young kids also, 4th, 5th grade. They can break them down, but certainly it makes for a great project for the upper grades, middle schoolers and high schoolers, very important. And also this idea of, the perceptions that are among the enslavers when they are out to reclaim their property. And they talk about these individuals who pretend to be free, right? There's that language of pretend to be free. And that to me is just like, that's sort of the American paradox. If we are creating this country and talking about liberty and justice and freedom, et cetera, and yet you have these individuals who know that they have a right to have human rights of freedom and expect to be able to roam and do the things that they need to do. Yet there's this title about pretending to be free, which I just find, absolutely appalling.
And to your point about enslaved Africans making the claims about freedom, that's another way that you can find enslaved people in the archives with the court petitions that they're filing to ensure that they have their freedom recognized during this time. So let's talk a little bit, change gears, and talk about gradual emancipation, right? We know that slavery is paramount to New York City at this time, but there are going to be some legislative acts that are passed at the turn of the 18th century. And can we talk about gradual emancipation?
If anybody is connected to CUNY, it's a 15, 16-week semester, and that Gradual Emancipation Act is so convoluted, it takes you the full 15 weeks, right, just to break it down. It is structurally racist to its core. So in 1799, New York State passes the Gradual Emancipation Act. It is the third time that New York State does so. The first two times it fails. And so it's an invitation to our students to think about the city we live in and think about our really complicated past, that we've not always been this bastion of freedom and liberty, if that's how we still see ourselves. And when it does so, the reason it's gradual is because it will take 28 years for slavery to end in New York State, right? The average life of an ordinary person. And so all of this is by design. Anybody born after July 4th, 1799 would have been free at the age of 28 if you were male and 25 if you were female, right? Essentially robbing people of their best years. With compensation to slaveholders. Like, it was so convoluted. The kick of that was, of course, if you were born before July 4th, 1799, right? You were born the day before July 3rd, there was no end date for slavery in New York State for you. And so it would take until 1817 till the writing was really on the wall. Like, the rest of the North had abolished slavery and had done so either before that Revolutionary War, during, or just immediately after. New York State goes kicking and screaming. They're the second to last northern state to abolish slavery, neighboring New Jersey being the last. And so again, going back to that curriculum guide, you have in there the birth certificate for a very young person who was born in 1804, an invitation to think about with your students in your classrooms, or just to think about as a New Yorker, of what it would have meant for them, right there in between those two periods. Born after 1799, they would have been free at the age of 25. However, they're born in 1804, so the idea that there is an end date for slavery in sight is only by the fact that should they survive slavery and make it to 25, then they will be free. 1817 doesn't exist yet, and so they will not know on July 4th, 1827, that is when slavery will finally be abolished in New York State, and therefore RCC.
And the idea that the Hamiltons and the Jays and all these folks who are supposedly magnanimous individuals, they sit and argue and debate, and they're thinking about, well, yeah, we need to do it, but how's this going to work for us? How's this going to impact our bottom line? If we do this, and also thinking about how this is going to impact their relationships with those in the South, because we do have this relationship with the Southern planters who are expecting to they have a relationship with them, and they're expecting to gain something from the North. And so it's not, it's so entrenched that it is so difficult to cut the cord, right, and really start fresh and start anew. There were moments when they were talking about, oh, maybe we could we can free, manumit these folks and allow them to be run for office, but they can't vote. All these little moments, these caveats of just like, what are you thinking about? You can do the work, you can do this, but you can't vote. Keep them out of the political process. Why? They were thinking they would follow the Whigs and the people that they had originally been enslaved with, and that they didn't have minds of their own to be able to make decisions that were going to benefit them should these folks who would eventually become free, eventually be able to probably purchase property. You know, of course, it comes with all kinds of requirements if once they do allow for individuals to become free, and that we're talking men in particular, black males, you know, had to own property, they had to own, be able to establish residency, and they were, in order to vote and be a part of the political process. And if they didn't meet all of those requirements, they might be free, but all they could do was they couldn't participate in the political process.
Thank you. I just want to add something really quickly with this 1817, Gradual Emancipation Act that's then passed. It's really done by the advocacy of working class black New Yorkers who are really concerned with the idea that this initial Gradual Emancipation Act in 1799 will create something like an uneven household. As you could imagine, you could have siblings who were born before the first Gradual Emancipation Act in 1799, and then some that are born after. And so this sort of unequal freedom that is proposed in 1799 makes black New Yorkers very anxious, and they're the ones who are working in tandem with white men who have the political power, like John Jay, to make sure that this 1817 Gradual Emancipation Act is enacted, and then slavery is ultimately abolished in 1827. Can we talk about some of the black abolitionists who are at the forefront of abolishing this institution of slavery in the city?
Well, I'd mentioned David Ruggles earlier, who was part of the Vigilance Committee. We had Russ Worm, who was part of the, started the newspaper, oh gosh, why am I, Freedom's Journal. Yes, Freedom's Journal, who is fighting. We have David Walker, who is fighting and writing pamphlets and really getting people excited and riled up to understand what are my rights here and what are your rights, and making sure that people are indeed aware. Of course, you also have William Hamilton. You had a lot of the clergy, the black clergy, who are part of this circuit. You have Peter Williams Jr., who's part of St. Philip's Church, and they're using the church as the pulpit to be able to educate individuals to say, we have to rally around. We are the people we've been waiting for, and we must find a way to be able to help ourselves to move into this space of freedom. And even though a lot of these individuals who were the black abolitionists, they may have stolen themselves and were considered to be fugitive seekers, and they were eventually freedom seekers, and they eventually settled in New York and or Canada and came back down and rallied around and sort of were part of a network. Often we hear stories about it was all about the white abolitionists who really helped, who made this happen. And indeed, it was really Henry Highland Garnett, and a lot of these folks did indeed go through the African free schools that were set up by the Manumission Society, and they were able to, through networking and through being in this tight community of individuals who all they did was talk about freedom, lived for freedom. They would, just do anything to support themselves, to support the families. And once they got freedom, that wasn't enough. They had to go out and make sure that they were taking care of their neighbors, of kinfolk. There was this kinfolk situation that was happening. Just because I'm free doesn't mean that I'm good, right? They can snatch me and take me and my family and send us down into the deep south if we don't watch out. So there's just an incredible amount of conversation. There's an incredible amount of organizing that is happening, the conventions that they're having to bring black men together, the women supporting these folks. They're trying to establish the African Mutual Relief Society. They're working to bring people together to just really the word community meant so much in the broadest sense of the word. And so you had Charles B. Ray was an abolitionist. You had Peter Guignon. You had, I mean, there's just a slew of individuals. You had folks out in Brooklyn who you want to talk about our Brooklyn people.
We had,
Pursuit.
yeah, absolutely. So there were abolitionists out in Brooklyn as well, who weren't getting the kind of funding that they were in Manhattan. You know, and we're doing very similar things, thinking about what does the Black church mean? How can we use it as a space, not just of faith, but as political organizing? They were thinking about schools and businesses. And of course, that kind of radical dreams and possibilities leads to something like Weeksville, founded in 1838, just 11 years after slavery ends in New York State. And I also just want to include, just because Cynthia had alluded to these silences in the archives, that Black women in this time period were absolutely at the center of organizing. Just because our archives tell us one thing, right? So it's always the Black men who went to these conventions. There is a scholar called P. Gabrielle Foreman, who is now a MacArthur genius, long overdue, who quite rightly says, when thinking about these conventions, okay, but these homes, who was keeping these homes? Who was opening the doors to these guests to stay? And who were the children in these homes who were listening to these stories and being trained to be the activists for the next generation? Let's not exclude their voices and their labor. It reminds me of a collection right here at the Schomburg, thinking about all the jewels that, you know, Dr. Moten opened with. The Lyons family archival papers. Maritza Lyons, who collected her family's papers, writes her own memoirs. All of that and the gorgeous daguerreotypes are all housed right here at the Schomburg. So thinking about an ordinary Black family, you know, who were probably trying to send their kids to school in the same way that I was rushing my kid to school this morning, and all the things that family brings, but at the same time constantly organizing for better futures.
And your idea about how organizing is happening throughout the city, not just with elite or more well-heeled African Americans, is really essential. It makes me think about the role that colored schools played in this greater fight for abolition. There was an educator by the name of Fanny Tompkins who taught at Colored School number 2 in Lower Manhattan. And so Cynthia talked about how there was the African Free School, but by the 1830s, Black New Yorkers collectively said that that school system will not, you know, that school system will not work, and that they actually advocated for the headmaster of that school to be taken out of that position and instead be replaced with Black educators. And that's why we have, at that time, such a large number of Black teachers and Black school principals. But during the Civil War era, Black teachers like Fanny Tompkins and other women educators were essential to instructing about the Civil War, about freedom, about emancipation. And this one educator, Fanny Tompkins, right at the start of the Civil War, when John Brown leads his insurrection on Harper's Ferry, she, alongside her students, raised money for the martyrs, for the Black martyrs, for their families to support them. And so it's not just happening in these sort of elite, well-heeled settings, but it's also happening in places like schools, where schools and teachers are very instructive in teaching the future generations about emancipation, about their rights. So thank you. And
there's so much cross-pollination, right? People may reside in Manhattan or in Staten Island, but they know what's going on in Brooklyn. Everybody knows each other, even though separated by a river or waterways. And they're really, again, this is this idea of the network and the organizing that is taking place, which in addition to this idea of establishing communities and of establishing organizations to be able to support individuals, to protect people, to free people, to raise money for education, etc. They are really in concert with one another to make sure that we must fight. The only way we're going to win this is if we stand together, and we're making clothing for the kids to go to school with the Dorcas Society. We are supporting each other by buying each other's newspapers and making sure that we are out there selling and beating the drum. And we're going to go down during the Civil War, send some of our educators down to the South to be able to help to educate the folks down in the South. So there's a lot of connection that is happening. And with the Lyons family, in addition to being on location, they do They had owned some property in Seneca Village. They lived in Brooklyn. They lived on St. Felix Street. They were very prominent folks, Shinnecock folk from out in Long Island initially. There's the history of the ethnicity of Albro Lions. They eventually moved to Rhode Island, and they are fighting for their kids to be educated in Rhode Island. And there's just a lot of, incredible fight and know-how. And it's all very strategic. These folks were very, very strategic about the ways in which they fought and saw the situations that were there, and just never, the perseverance was the key, and faith was the key for a lot of these individuals. They couldn't do things without their churches, they couldn't do things without each other, and they made a lot of sacrifices financially, psychologically, it was just a rather, you talked about, let's try to sort of envision what this time period looked like and what was happening. Hustling, bustling, really, really, the connections were just phenomenal.
Thank you. And so I want to just think about this question. How do we teach this history to school children? This complicated history, this history that we call sometimes hard history. Any strategies, any advice?
Who is it hard for?
Perfect
The question is, why is it hard? Who is it hard for? I don't understand that, and I think that children love a good story, right? Adults love a good story. I think when you go in and you find these stories and you present it as a story, or if you're able to set things up so that as a teacher, perhaps you sort of pre-select a few things, but you send them on a hunt. And these folks are, young people are made to be detectives, to be able to learn critically, think critically about how this connects to that and that connects to this. Children are very, very capable of understanding the nuances of things. And that question of, we sort of, when children are really young and they're just like, well, why? And they just exhaust you, and you're just like, oh my gosh, we just shut up, right? 'Cause that's it, end of story. But that's what we want. We want them to be able to keep asking the whys and never be satisfied, because that is why this research that is going on about slavery in New York continues to transcend. We keep finding more information, and somebody didn't stop at this particular point and just say, okay, that's it. There is more to be found. There are, people will tell you that it's not available. You can't find the information. Information is everywhere. Those footnotes, getting those kids to learn how to read footnotes and tell, that is also a way of sort of stitching stories together. And as we said earlier, getting out into the landscape and finding out. Some of these schools are named after individuals. Why is this name what it is, right? Why do I go to, whether it's an enslaver's name or whether it's the name of someone in African-American history, go do the research and find out about, and don't just show up in the space just because. There's meaning behind the language that we use. There's meaning behind everything that we do. And so I think if we're able to sort of work to dissect that and work through it, that's a great way to get children interested in learning in the process. Also looking at images, looking at art, bringing art into the fold, listening to music, the poetry that was written back in the day. There's nothing greater than the exposure of being able to, again, piece together the puzzles.
Yeah, as a parent of a 7-year-old, they do say why a lot, a lot. And so I think taking that curiosity and working with it is crucial. I am a child of a port city. It's 3,000 miles away, and it's called Liverpool. And I asked why a lot too. Why do our buildings look the way they do? Who lived here before we did? Why do we get told we have the oldest Chinatown? And learning for me in real time about the history of slavery enabled cities like New York and Liverpool to be the kind of cities and the architectural gems that we all sort of love today. understanding that twinned history, understanding as a person who's Desi, right, of South Asian descent, and understanding, like my grandmother, when I would go home to India, would tell me certain stories of colonial struggle, and understanding then, right, my West Indian friends back in Liverpool, how we were talking about similar stories of what empire does, what capitalism does to cities and to nations. I think children, I mean, this, honestly, because I get asked this a lot, how did you become a historian? I was like, I was just a really curious child. And I was, pardon me, desperate to understand my place in Liverpool as a proud Scouser, and I was also desperate to understand it as a person of South Asian descent. So I've always seen our shared histories, our shared struggles. And that is because I just had excellent educators who were willing to answer the why for me.
I also think that science, bringing science into the fold, nature, the cosmos, right, the soil, what is that all about? Because that had an impact on those folks who were those freedom seekers who were coming up from the South and bringing their skill set. How did they know to follow and to, run away in the evenings in the dead of the winter from the South, because and where there's no cover because the leaves are falling off the trees and you're really out there and you're exposed, yet there was a sense of being able to sort of move along the riverways or follow the railroad paths, and just having those kinds of supports that were there. And again, in the story of those who were these Underground Railroad conductors, et cetera, we often hear that it was the white folks who were really helping them. The network of African people who were there to help to support these folks, to hide them, to be on the lookout for them, to stick them in the wagons and cover them up and get them out and under. It was just really kind of genius when you think about it, to be able to survive and to make your way. And even when you got to the north, got to Philadelphia, you got to New York, it still wasn't always safe. And some people just felt that they had to continue to go on to Canada or to the farther reaches, the north of New York, and be in Rochester and the Syracuse area, et cetera, where we had a very big abolition and supportive community for those who, the freedom seekers who landed in those spaces.
Thank you both. And I just want to share that doing this work, you're not doing it by yourself. The Schomburg Center, like we've talked about, has resources, and the Schomburg Center also has the Junior Scholars Program for middle and high school students, which was a great resource for me. One of the educators that I got to work with, M. Scott Johnson's in the front, and he introduced me to all these primary source materials that got me really interested in this history of Black people, I mean broadly across the country, globe, and the world, but definitely in New York City as well. Working with primary sources is something that was really, really important to me in my own personal development. So it's one thing to have the stuff online, which is great, but then also if you have the opportunity to bring them into the space so that they can see these documents, I think that would be really critical for them as well. Thank you both so much for this conversation. Thank you, thank you. We will now reserve the next 15 minutes or so for question and answers. And if you have any questions, we invite you to go to the back. There's a microphone there, and we'll get started with Q&A. Thank you.
My name is John Derek Novell, and first I'd like to thank Cynthia Copeland because I worked with her at Seneca Village, the celebration of Pinkster, and I saw Pinkster come to life. And now, knowing you, we need your help because next year is the 400th anniversary of the Black community of New York, 1626 to 2026. It's also the celebration of Pinkster, the oldest holiday. Pinkster was a Dutch term for African Pentecost, and the 11 who were brought here in slavery were 11 Angolans, as they were called, but they were Angolans and Congolese from the empire of Alfonso the Great, the Catholic African emperor, and he was a part of what was known as Bantu Catholicism. And so we need your help because next year will be the Pinkster year, and we want to celebrate from next year, May 23rd, all the way through May 18th, from 2026 to 2027. I'm a persona non grata now because of something I said about Trump and the African Burial Ground that treated us horribly this year with our Pinkster celebration. And I was with the Museum of the City of New York. I was thing on Spectrum TV, and I just said what I needed to say about Trumpenstein, as I call him, and I'm not welcome, I think, anymore. So we told the African Burial Ground people, because they're very demoralized, join with us in our historical organizations, and that will give you strength. And so that is what I'm asking of you. And then there's one other thing. The African Pinkster King was the beginning of democracy in New York. And so more needs to be talked about him because he was the king of the Pentecost, or the Pinkster celebration, and his whole celebration was outlawed in 1811 because he had the Lenape and the Africans and even indentured whites that were joining with him, and they feared a revolution. And so they stopped the celebration, but there are African people buried under the state capitol at Albany. That must be solved. And finally, there's a bill. There is a bill that is the Reparations Commission Bill S.1163, the New York State Reparations Bill A/A7691, that will bring to light all of these celebrations. You're talking about the kids. We need to celebrate Pinkster. We need to celebrate that original holiday, and that, because out of that comes everything else like Juneteenth and the rest, and that's important, but Juneteenth was Texas. Pinkster was New York. And we need to celebrate that, working on that now and working that for next year. So I want to hear your opinions on that and opinions about the Pinkster King, Charles, who was the African Pinkster King.
Thank you, Derek. Yes, Pinkster was an important holiday. It was a sort of a combined Christian, Afro-Dutch kind of holiday that turned into an amazing celebration. It was very big up in Albany. We had some celebrations downstate, and it's around Pentecost. There's a flower that comes out when we think about it. So lots to think about indeed, but part of the African experience here. You know, the other thing we didn't really talk about is the role of African Americans in the American Revolution, which could be a whole nother conversation, especially since we're coming up on the 250th anniversary next year. But we did have so many members, males and females, working in support and thinking that once Guy Carleton and Lord Dunmore determined that you can get your freedom if you come and fight for the British. These folks were like, yeah, okay, I'm going to fight for the British. And they were taking off, and they were able to fight and support, thinking that the British and the Loyalists were actually going to be more powerful and were going to win against these, scrappy patriots that really weren't very organized. And so in the end, we know the story. Preethi's got the accent and doesn't, came from far away. We could have been talking like this, right, with the accent, but that didn't happen. And so, however, the Book of Negroes is a very important book that tells the story of the individuals who, once the African folks who did fight, did gain their freedom, the British sent them off on boats up to Canada. They settled New Brunswick and other areas in Canada. But within that Book of Negroes, you have the names of the individuals, lots of women, lots of children who went off and headed up to settle once the, New York had been occupied by the British from 1776 until 1783. But you had a lot of incredible activity and action and weighing and debates that were going on among people of African heritage. So.
Yes, hi, good evening. I'm here with my mom, who is, Mom, you can wake up. Mom, are you okay? I'm here with my mother, who is a retired New York City Public School librarian, and she turned 91 years fabulous this past September, and I'm very happy that I wore my Sankofa bird. We're losing our librarians. That itself is tragic and terrible. I'm glad I wore my Sankofa necklace today. We live literally a stone's throw away in Brooklyn from Lefferts House. And I was thinking about the fact that one of the things that's on my bucket list is to make the trip to Auburn, New York, where Harriet Tubman lived, and making all the way to the terminus, which is St. Catharines in Canada. My question is this: as someone who is a lifelong student and daughter of, well, on both sides of my family tree, on both sides of my parentage, I've got educators. My grandfather was the third provost at Tuskegee University on my mother's side of the family. My question is this: you mentioned the Lenape. I'm glad you did. I've got Choctaw on my father's side. We are all one with, well, to cut to the chase, one thing that I did not experience as a child growing up, and I have yet to hear it, what are anyone's thoughts about the reality check of being taught that the US was founded by terrorists, for terrorists, and we are basically speaking, it has always been a terrorist nation. As Professor Greg Carr said, we are a settler state that is continuing to spread.
Well, that is, again, it is, I'm not trying to, cop out and not respond, but I always say language is really something that, and the ways in which we use it, it is true that things were forcibly taken. The land that we call the United States, or, the indigenous call North America or Turtle Island, forcibly taken, right? People forcibly taken from other spaces and brought here to work under the lash, to have that sort of enforcement of sorts to exist. It is terrorizing. It is horrible that this happened. But I do think that depending upon, as educators in the room, we do have to be, we want children to sort of arrive at their decisions and how they want to interpret and see how these things are, think about the language that they want to use. I think it's really important for us to be able to, again, talk about the violence that was involved in order to make this country what it is, because it is definitely violent. We can't deny that. But how far you want to take it, or how far you want the students to take it, I think that involves a lot of conversations in different spaces and different situations to be able to address that. I know I'm being kind of guarded and protected and all, but some words have a real powerful and lasting kind of punch and an ability to sort of see things, and we don't. If children are going off and coming off with this idea of this being, terrorists and things of that sort, it can be a little bit dodgy, and we might not be able to have schools and classes, and if we, they're shutting down things right now and banning books and saying all kinds of things that we're indoctrinating, and we're not indoctrinating, we're just telling the truth. And, the truth is that it was a violent beginning, and the legacy is violent, right? The legacy is still quite violent. When you think about lack of housing, when you think about, poor education, when you think about non-access to medical and health care, when you think about, women, black women, not being able to have, dying in pregnancies and things of that sort, it's violent, right? No denying.
And to your point, Cynthia, I think a sort of instructive exercise to have students think about is that this country is the only, or when it was founded, the only democracy in the Western Hemisphere, right? And to have them sit with the idea that this country is supposed to be a democracy, but at the same time that the framers of this country are thinking about democracy, ideas about freedom and equality, you also have slavery that is inextricably linked to the development of this country. And I think that it's important to have them sit with both of those ideas to think about what this country means, and the sort of ethos of what America's supposed to represent, but then also what it's supposed to represent for Black people. And that is an answer that is, you leave it up to them and they have to grapple with that. So thank you for your question. We can take another question from person in the back.
Yes, thank you. Good evening. When you were talking about Brooklyn being the largest, but also was saying that unlike in the South, there was closer quarters with the enslaved, weren't there also plantations up here? Because I know in research, the Botanical Gardens, the Bronx Zoo, you mentioned Van Cortlandt. I'm gathering that since it was agriculture in Brooklyn, so didn't they have like a plantation type of setup in those? Also, I'm from the Bronx, and there was a brother, his name was Morgan Powell. He was found dead after he was uncovering a lot of our story by Hunts Point. There's an African burial ground there. He was doing walking tours. So there's a lot in the Bronx also. But my primary question, though, was they really like living closer in quarters, or didn't they still have a similar layout like down south with the plantations where they were? And also I was curious, how did Brooklyn get to be the largest of all of them, since it was kind of an all over? Thank you.
Sure, thank you so much, and thank you for talking about Morgan Powell. So the reason we say Kings County was the second largest slaveholding capital is because we're talking about percentages or numbers, right? The number of slaveholders to enslaved people was just as high, just slightly less than South Carolina, meaning 1 in every 3 Brooklynite was a person of African descent and they were enslaved. So that's where that kind of number comes from. I am not an architectural historian, so again, I just kind of lean on brilliant people who are. But the reason we don't refer to plantations in New York City is because it's misleading, right? They were not the traditional sort of slave homes or quarters that you have on plantations in the South here in New York. You might have had a great deal amount of land, like the Van Cortlandt Park, if we're talking about the Bronx, or if we're thinking about the Phillips. Yes, absolutely, Phillips Manor. And then if we're thinking about most of Brooklyn, the reason Brooklyn takes so long to become a city in itself is because it is mostly agricultural, right? So it is that one house that owns all of that land, usually the street names that we think of today, Prospect Lefferts, Pierre Ponce. Thank you so much, Cynthia. I used to be able to rattle these off, and I'm like, all of that, right? So the land might have been just as big, but in terms of architecture, you are thinking about sort of in the wintertime, where are these enslaved people living and staying? They're staying in the same quarters, often in the same house, just because these were much more modest homes than the kind of more mid to late 19th century homes in the South.
Thank you. No, this is fine. And we'll take a question now from you in the back, on the left-hand side.
I'm glad you were able to fit me in. So I live downtown Manhattan. I live actually a 5-minute walk from the African burial ground. So you see the African burial ground. To get to where I live at, you would have to have passed by the first African Free School. Then is the first Jewish cemetery on a street that led to the ferry that would take you over to Brooklyn, which I just found out was a very historic route at one particular point. And I'm holding here a visual aid, which has, because you didn't mention, the Lyons family had a home on the same block where I lived at. And the only 2 markers is the African burial ground and what you could call the auction block for where the slavery took place. I just found out also that I live in a historic district. The area is known as Chinatown. I got into the history through activism, and knowing that activism was all around me and I did not know it, on a block where I actually would take names for a petition to keep people from being displaced is very ironic to me. So I wanted to know what more could be done as far as placemaking, because it's extremely important. I do a lot of outreach for the African burial ground, and they tell me when I do my outreach that the Black children on their own they do not want to go to the African burial ground because they only know one side of the history. I try in my own way to uplift the activism, the Black activism that went on there. It's very helpful when you have partnerships with school. I also forgot to mention, there's also PS1, which is the evolution of the African Free School, PS1. I don't even know if they know that history, so if you can help me find out how more we can do with placemaking.
So currently, New York State is thinking about reparations. So they have the New York State Community Commission on Reparations, and so they're thinking about reparations very broadly, but one of the things that they're thinking about is exactly what you're talking about as far as placemaking and thinking about the different parts of across the state where there can be greater emphasis on Black history and on places where Black people are doing some of the work that you're talking about as far as organizing and activism. And they have a website, and it's the New York State Community Commissions on Reparations, and they are taking like testimonies, and that is a way that you can submit your thoughts and talk to the community commissioners to make sure that those things are recognized when they submit their proposal to the state. And I think that that is one of, that's a particular avenue that you can take to ensure that these sites of Black history are being recorded and are being remembered.
Years ago, there was a project called Repo History, and it was all about signage, right? And these artists got together and they sort of learned the truth about locations, and they were able to attach it to the street names, but they had sort of these histories or renaming of things. I think that's something that if you look up Repo History, you can maybe get an idea and a sense, and it might be interesting to try to get together with artists who can have a spin on that particular, if not bring that particular campaign back, maybe do something that's a little bit more, because I think that was like in the 1980s, 1990s. You might be able to bring something, even if it's temporal. Maybe it's just, maybe you're doing it online, and you're able to click on something and be able to see it and it dissolves. But this idea of having something in the landscape, I think, is an interesting way. And whenever you can bring artists together to sort of have an arresting type of project that will stop people in their tracks to get them to sort of think, and question, that might be a way to bring some more attention to what you're talking about in your neighborhood.
So we have 5 more minutes for questions. So I think we have 1 and then 2 over there. Are you okay? So you can start.
Okay. Hi, my name is Naire Taveras. I'm an 11th grade U.S. history teacher in the South Bronx, so I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for being here. I have a question about, so I'm trying to gain a picture of what the Black population looked like in New York City, because I know that there's a mixture of free Black people and then enslaved people. And trying to understand how the abolitionist movement came about. Almost kind of like when I think of the Harlem Renaissance, I imagine all the greats walking around Harlem and gathering in these spaces to have conversations. So I'm curious how people who were enslaved were able to gain that knowledge. Was it because there were 2 to 3 enslaved people to one enslaver? Does that mean that they had more freedom to like live and access these spaces? Like, I'm just trying to understand how this network of abolitionists was able to be created here.
To your question, I would say that, with them first being enslaved, that's their status, their sort of legal status, but there's a strong sort of institutional life that's happening where people are learning about these things from one another. So Cynthia pointed to earlier, and Preeti as well, as far like churches are a space where people are coming together, both free and enslaved, to talk about possibilities, to talk about emancipation as well. So when we think about the churches in particular in New York, you have Trinity Church, you have, you'll later have during early 19th century, like the African Methodist Episcopal Church, then the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. And these spaces are really important for organizing. There's a scholar by the name of Craig Wilder who points to the fact that even people who are not affiliated with those churches, right, some of these people might have been a part of the Dutch Reformed Church, they were going to these black churches to mobilize around these items and objects. And then there's also an article that I can share with you. It's by a scholar named Sarah Grossing-Sater, who writes about working class black people during the 1860s who had a really strong, what she calls, legal acumen. So people who had very little literacy, but knew the law and that they were coming together. Another example Cynthia pointed to is the Vigilance Committee, which you have free black people working in tandem with enslaved black people to ensure that they are free and to ensure that they're not being captured. So there's a really sort of strong connection between both free and enslaved black people in New York, particularly because free people, as you can imagine, their freedom is tied to the fact that enslaved people, that slavery still exists, right? And that's something that they're working to abolish, and they do so in tandem with one another.
And again, the idea of this free versus enslaved,
Yeah.
tricky, right? The power brokers, after a while, those manumission folks, you know, they were happy for a while, but then when these folks were becoming free and they were starting to populate the areas a little bit much, and the tensions of how am I going to respond to a black person when I don't see them as a true person, free or otherwise, or enslaved? Oh, let's have the colonization society, and let's like ship them all back to Africa, right? So there are these situations that are happening in a lot of the free states where they don't want any more free people to come to, you know, your spaces, because you're going to be able to put messages in the minds of those who are enslaved and work to free them, right? So it's very complicated and very messy, you know, which we didn't really talk about the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, that, you know, and they've had a few of those back and forth, you know, over the years. And people are not going to rat out people; they're going to protect them. But at the same time, you know, if you get caught, somebody's going to snatch your kids, or the blackbirders who are coming up here, and the warnings, don't let your kids out at night. They're going to come and they're going to take you. You are free, but we will grab you and bring you into the deep south, and you will never see these people again, right? So it's very complicated, but still you have these folks that are working to try to support people and get the abolitionists, the free and the enslaved folks working together. In the Lemons case, you want to talk
No,
about
really quickly. So we have 2 questions left. You'll go, and then you'll go, and then we'll do one response per group,
that? Okay.
per panelist.
Hello, good evening. I'm not going to take up anybody's time too much. I just wanted to know, in thinking about, for example, Africana studies and just like the theory stuff that is very important to me that I know is extremely important to you. I try to teach a lesson where I'm like, yeah, we got to do Orlando Patterson, Slavery, Social Death. How do you feel about just introducing theory to kids? Like, what do you think is probably the best method in order to introduce them to this important theory so that we can move through these stories in a way that's seamless?
And what grade or where were you teaching?
I teach in the Bronx. I teach high school, so I teach some 9th graders, 11th graders, and 12th grade.
I think one of the best things you can do that borrows from Black Studies is explain that all of this was created in community, right? All of this scholarship, all of these historians are not just writing about community, we are working in community. I think that's one of the best things you can teach students in your classroom about how knowledge production or how knowledge comes to be.
As a collective. As a collective. For sure, yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for a very interesting conversation. And I have 2 questions. It's very interesting how places and dates provide anchors for activism today. One is rather straightforward. Can you comment on the Jap Davis research indicating that the initial enslaved Africans arrived in New Amsterdam in January 1627 and not in 1626?
Are you familiar? Yeah. Can you tell us a little more about that?
So I've read the article.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I don't think that his scholarship necessarily was refuting that enslaved Africans didn't come in 1626. I think what he's saying that there was another ship that we didn't know about that came in 16.
He's suggesting that was the first ship, which, just wondering. The second, perhaps a little more meaningful, is the community that came to be known as Little Africa that was established between Soho and Greenwich Village in the 1640s, 1650s in response to the demands of enslaved African Americans under New Amsterdam. Took root, thrived for quite some period. Can you comment on the fate of that community in later New Amsterdam history and under the English?
The land was taken, you know, the British come and the African, those 11 African, men from the Dutch, the original folks who came from there, they were awarded these plots of land. They lived there, they were there for a while, but then the British come and the story changes. And that's just, you know, the end of the story, sadly. But we do know from the archives that we are able to tell the story and let people know that they were indeed in that Tribeca, Soho, West Village area and had been there for a significant amount of time. They were the original, they had the land, families developed, there was a community of folk that were there. This idea of Little Africa actually starts down in the 5 Points and goes up to the area close to 34th Street near Macy's. It was really vast, and but it is land that unfortunately gets taken away.
Right. Do we know whether there's been much original research or whether documents exist in regard to how that land was taken?
I feel like Kamau Ware is working on that though, Black Gotham experience. You might reach out to Kamau because they were working on a project on Land of the Blacks and what happened to all of that land. So that might be
And there's that park right over in around Crosby Street, I think, where they are honoring the original Dutch folks that were there. So that was used. That came about through the research of being in the archives and the activism that occurred, and turning that into a city park. Okay. I also want to, I don't know if you all are aware of the Northeast Slavery Records Index. That is an index that is available. So the Northeast Slavery Records Index started at John Jay College, John Jay University. It's part of the city universities. There are several universities that are doing work to aggregate all of the materials that are sources, newspapers, runaway slave ads, manifests, you name it, you can find it, and it's a database that's being built. It's just gone live, but people are constantly adding to it, and I think it's an incredible resource. It looks at what's happening in the whole Northeast region, so you can find things in Rhode Island and Connecticut and New York, and you can break it down, American Revolution people, you can find stuff about the Dutch, etc. So it's a really incredible resource that I would highly recommend, in addition to this great curriculum that we have here that is available to you.
And that is time. Thank you so much for this amazing conversation. Thank you. This is great, and thank you all for being here.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our engaged audience. We do want to ask you to please scan the QR code, if we can get the QR code. Yes, to complete our survey. So complete our survey. If you're a teacher, you have to complete the survey to receive your CTLE credit. The link will stay open until tomorrow at 6 p.m. So if you can scan the QR code to complete the survey, that would be fantastic. Thank you so much for coming out, for spending your evening with us, for asking all of your critical and crucial questions. Stay tuned for more events from Schomburg Education, and also more events as we continue to celebrate our Schomburg Centennial. So thank you so much.